Well, Psych 4.2. Starting off with Shinedown's Bully. We're going to talk about bullies today a little bit. Classical conditioning. Saw Shinedown live once. Ain't bad. Not really my cup of tea, but it was a good show. Classical conditioning. Now, as mentioned in yesterday's class, we oftentimes talk about classical conditioning as the sort of the don't want to use the word classic because it's classical, but the great example of classical conditioning is always Pavlov's dog. I want to hit you from a little different angle, today. Always, Pavlov's dog always gets all the attention. Let's kind of take a little different swirl on things here. Let's take a little different take on things here. So when we talk about classical conditioning, we're really talking about creating a change, right? And creating a change or a modification in a behavior. And we're going to start with a sort of a before, the old before and after, if you will. Right? So here's the before scenario. And we're going to use some pretty complex psychological terminology here. And this is what I want you to be responsible for, as part of our class, is some of this more advanced terminology should become more commonplace that you're used to using in life. Okay, so we're going to start with a stimulus, right? A stimulus is something that elicits a reaction, and we're going to call this an unconditioned stimulus, meaning there has been no manipulation to the stimulus. This is an unconditioned stimulus, which we will sort of put into abbreviations. If I find a different color, that would be great. We're going to call this the US, not United States, but unconditioned stimulus. And if there is an unconditioned stimulus, that's going to lead to, right, a little arrow leads to. I'm going to write leads to. It's probably so small on your screen you can't even read it, but it says leads to. That's going to lead to an unconditioned response. So an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. And the unconditioned response to that stimulus, we're going to call this the UR. And as an example, we're going to use bullying in school. Let me find a different color again. All right, and let's say the unconditioned stimulus is a bully. In fact, we're not even in school yet. We're going to introduce that idea in a second. Just a plain old bully. Real shake you down for your lunch money type of bully kid. You run into this kid anywhere. And bullies elicit an unconditioned response in our brain psychologically, and we are afraid. So bullies lead to fear. That is an unconditioned stimulus that leads to an unconditioned response. A bully leads to us, when we encounter bullies in our lives, it generally leads to us being afraid. Okay? So that is the unconditioned piece. Then we introduce control. So this is the sort of the pre-experiment situation. Then we enter in like an experimental control, which we've talked about in the past. And as a control, we're going to introduce something that's totally neutral, which we're going to refer to as a neutral stimulus or a controlled stimulus, if you will. So it's going to be totally neutral, meaning it doesn't have an effect on people one way or the other. Okay, it's just a completely neutral item, and we're going to refer to this as the conditioning stimulus. So this is not unconditioned, this is a conditioning stimulus. Meaning the conditioning piece, I should have defined it up here, right? This is where we start to make those manipulations and modifications. And I think we defined this in our previous lesson, right? This is a modification to a behavior And so here is the sort of unconditioned, there is no modification here. Bullies cause fear. Now we're going to enter into a neutral conditioning stimulus. It would be neutral, it wouldn't normally have any effect. And we are going to label this conditioning stimulus in green. We're going to call this the CS, because we're eventually getting to a math equation here. All right, this is the conditioning stimulus, or the neutral stimulus, or the controlled stimulus. You could probably refer to it any which way. And what we're going to introduce as a neutral conditioning stimulus is school. Okay? School doesn't really make kids afraid. It's totally neutral. In fact, school is just like a separate environment that you travel to each day in the morning, and it doesn't really probably affect an emotional response one way or the other, at least not yet. You might be sitting at home going, well, that's not true, but you've already been in school and you've sort of been hit with these conditioned and unconditioned and conditioning stimuluses your whole life. So you probably have feelings about school now. But a bully leads to people being afraid. A school doesn't necessarily lead to anything. Okay? It's just a place that you travel to. Here's where the magic happens. Here's where the conditioning happens, which we'll label. Let me make sure that we're on the screen. Yep, we're still on the screen. So now we're going to go to number 3. Sort of the third step is what a psychologist would say is the conditioning. So here is where this modification will take place. And I'm going to use the abbreviations now in green. Hopefully the green shows up on the screen. It's not the best, but it's getting there. We're going to take the unconditioned stimulus, and we're going to add the conditioning stimulus. And we are going to find that there is an unconditioned response. Why? Because the bully is always going to elicit fear. Right? So if you took the conditioning stimulus out of the equation, it would still work. Right? It's not really, I guess, like math per se, but what we're eventually going to find is that there is, there's some sort of property in math. Was it transitive? I'm going to have you guys tell me that one in class. But there's sort of a mathematical property where if the unconditioned stimulus leads to the unconditioned response, when you start adding this conditioned stimulus in this case, school, eventually what we might find is step 4 over here, the sort of result of this experimental situation, or the before and after, if you will. All right, so after we have performed this conditioning, this modification, then what we will find is that the conditioning stimulus will in fact lead to the unconditioned response. And so let's think about this in red now. Okay, let's go back to our red and really think through this. It's basically Pavlov's dog, but in a different scenario. I got a bully, right? I got the bully. Bully leads to people being afraid. School is sort of neutral, right? School doesn't really affect your fear, and people aren't like afraid of school per se. But what we're going to do is we're going to have people encounter the bully in the school. And what ends up happening psychologically is that kids then associate school, right? They have been, their thinking has been modified, and their response is now that school, this conditioning stimulus, actually makes them afraid, and it makes them experience fear. And so there are students, and perhaps you're one of them, or perhaps not, right? But it is possible psychologically that something totally innocuous and that's supposed to be positive, like school, right, through the introduction of these unconditioned stimulus into that same environment, it is possible psychologically that we start to associate school with that same fear that we experience from bullying, right? And there's kids that might be like anxious or have anxiety about coming to school in general, or maybe just on a certain day, right? Because they're afraid to encounter that bully there. And then the mere thought of school then becomes sort of anxiety and fear provoking. that's the basic idea of classical conditioning. We could go back and do the more boring, traditional example of Pavlov's dog, right? I've got a dog, I've got food, right? I got dog food, and it makes the dog's mouth water, right? So there's food as the unconditioned stimulus, and it creates this unconditioned response where the dog gets slobbery, right? And then you introduce a control, right? In fact, you're not even introducing it yet. You just establish like a bell. If I ring a bell, the dog really does nothing, okay? The dog does nothing. But if I present food while ringing the bell, the dog then modifies its behavior to associate the food with the bell, and eventually just the mere sound of the bell will make the dog's mouth water. Eventually, this conditioning can wear off. Or goes into what a psychologist would say is extinction. See if that fit on the screen. Yeah. Right. So eventually this conditioning can wear off. I forgot the other F and off. And this conditioned response can become extinct. However, psychologists also found that even after a period of extinction, if you reintroduce the concept a little bit further down the road, wait a little while, take some time off, and then reintroduce that conditioned stimulus again, you do get maybe not as severe as a response, an unconditioned response, but you do get a little one. Okay, so classical conditioning can really modify a behavior, and even after that behavior is extinct, like if I were to remove school and the bully and kind of separate them back out, even after extinction, even after this modification and conditioning has worn off, it might still rear its head down the line psychologically a little bit. Okay? All right, great. Thanks. That's my classical conditioning lesson. We'll see you mañana. We'll hit Psych 4.3, a little bit more learning and memory. Adios.